Hello? Is that better? Okay. I'm Michael. Like he said, I'm a tech lead at Kroger Digital, aka KTD, it's the whole thing. But I am really happy to be here today to talk to you about Remix. We're going to do a lot of different stuff today. We're going to look at a lot of code. We're going to talk through some Remix features. It's going to be really interesting. I've spent the last couple months learning a lot about Remix. It's a relatively new framework. It is born out of the pandemic, but we'll get into that in just a second here. I do want to thank Kroger for supporting me in doing the speaking stuff. I really appreciate it, and we are always hiring, of course, if you are looking for a position with a cool company. So let's talk about a little bit about the history of Remix. There's not a long history. Like I said, Remix was born out of the pandemic. It was created by specifically by two guys, Michael Jackson and Ryan Florence. They had a consultant business called React Consulting, and they had some of the best consultants in the business, really incredible people. And what happened was March 2020, most of their business dried up, and they just had to let go of essentially their entire staff and figure out what they were going to do as a result. I remember all this going down as someone who scrolls Twitter a bit too much, seeing people talking about this and seeing some of these awesome people looking for jobs. And so what they did was they decided to try something new. They'd been building React apps for years, and they'd seen all kinds of different stuff and various problems and challenges that all the companies that they were working with are encountering. And they decided to build something that encompassed some of the vision that they had, what they would like to see in a React framework. And we're going to talk about some of those things today. And I think that experience that they've had working on so many really inspired a lot of awesome features that they've built into Remix. So we're going to talk about the Remix design philosophy today. And I think that has a lot to do with what makes Remix so special. I think that one of the best ways to understand a product and know what it is to specifically see what they charge for. So when I am looking into a new product, I often go to the pricing page almost first of all, because once you see what they're charging for, that kind of gives you an impression of what they're doing. Right now, Remix is free and open source software. That wasn't always true. They just charged for licenses. Their philosophy on that was, hey, the licenses encourage us to build an amazing product, and that's it, period. They ended up pivoting from that position, getting some venture funding, but I think they're still creating an amazing product. And this is one of the ways that they describe Remix. Remix is an edge-native, full-stack JavaScript framework for building modern, fast, and resilient user experiences. It unifies the client and server with web standards so you can think less about code and more about your product. I think that from my experience with Remix, this does really personify what is special and different about it. So as part of that, kind of taking them at their word, we're going to run through just a little bit more about what they say about Remix. So this is a slightly different blurb about it, but focused on web standards and modern web app UX. You're simply going to build better websites. You can, and we can start scrolling through here and see some of the features that they call out. Obviously, they got testimonials, actually some pretty impressive ones if we're being honest. You can see right off there, they start talking about while you're waiting for your static site to build, distributed web infrastructure got really good. Break through the static. So this leads into a little bit of story time, where I know a lot of you, probably most of you in here today are web developers. I would imagine that. Otherwise, you're just here to see me, and I'm very sorry. But we're going to take a quick trip back through the arc of web development history. Now, I haven't been in development for really all of this history, of course, but I have been around long enough to see the different things that have happened over time and to understand the effects that the past has had on current day. So, starting off, obviously, the very first web page, it's basically just a static text document. It is, and the web was initially built for exchanging documents. So you start with just HTML transferred over the internet, and that's the beginning of the World Wide Web. Then, as we move forward, we start to discover that companies and organizations want to add a little more to their website. They want it to render a little differently based on the time. And what you'll see there is they start to add server-side rendering. They're using a server-side language like .NET, Ruby. I mean, back then it was much different. But to generate a page, send a static HTML page to the client, and then the client could view that. Pretty straightforward, nothing too terribly fancy. They were fetching data from the database or wherever they wanted to get it from. Then we start to come along to where we start adding interactivity, the dawn of JavaScript. And obviously, the first things that people would do with JavaScript were kind of fun and silly. But then, as JavaScript began to develop and become more common, you'll start to see a lot more sites that add useful interactivity. And you see a lot of sites are still in that stage. I mean, so Stack Overflow, for an example, uses server-side rendered pages and mixes in some JavaScript for extra interactivity on the page. This is where we start to see things like Ajax and stuff like that. This is the period when I was kind of coming into web development. And it was great. We were able to do a lot of cool things. We were able to enhance the user experience via adding some JavaScript on the page. But it was kind of imperative. It was, you would essentially request the data from the server and make very specific modifications to the DOM. Or you would pull stuff out of the page and then send that to the server. So you had to kind of blend your JavaScript. You had to make sure that your JavaScript continued to work with your server rendered code and that everything stayed in sync. And what we discovered is that particularly as you started to build more complex applications, that became fragile. Oh, I changed this on the server and I forgot to change it in JavaScript. And out of that grew the rise of single-page applications. And this is when we started to see fully interactive applications running in the browser. Now, you know, some of the best examples of that are going to be things like Google Docs, where essentially you have a full-fledged desktop application running in your web browser, which I think we can all say is kind of incredible that we've developed to that point. But most of those, because of their interactivity, they didn't really have a server-side rendering component to a significant extent. And so what you saw was a lot of companies beginning to adopt this SPA architecture where they were using a client-side JavaScript framework, but they started to, as a result, a lot of companies when they first adopted that didn't realize some of the sacrifices that they were making. For instance, you have to pay the cost up front to load all that JavaScript, generate that page on the client, and you know, so a lot of times you're shipping a significant amount of code before you can display anything to the user. This has real impacts on performance and SEO and things like that. So definite trade-offs. Out of that kind of came a golden age of static site generators, which eliminated some of the issues, often by using those JavaScript frameworks and essentially generating the entire website at build time. So I have used some of these. I really enjoy them. For instance, this one here is the website for my developer conference, built with Gatsby, a static site generator, and we've been very happy with it. But it certainly has downsides with static site generators, and this is something you'll see Remix talk about a lot. For a static site generator, essentially almost all of the data has to be known at build time. So if you want to add something that is dynamic, that maybe changes based on user or based on server data that is updating more than every hour, then you have to add that dynamically on the client. Now, sorry, I skipped a moment there where talking about some of the benefits of static site generators. You're generating static files, which is, we're going back kind of to the dawn of the web, where it's super simple. You can serve those, you can cache those extremely efficiently. And it makes the mental model to work with a static site generator to be quite easy. It's like, oh, I build, I ship it. And one of the beautiful things is, so for example, I was able to create a really simple archive of the 2021 Momentum website just because it's static files. I can ship it up there, and I never worry that this is going to break because a database is going to go down or something like that. Sorry, a little drink of water here. But of course, we run into some of those complications with static site generators. They are a little bit constrained, where they can't do everything. And I've actually run into a variety of problems where people have started with a static site generator like Gatsby or something, and they discover that they've outgrown it. Now, that's not always a bad thing. We kind of, as an industry, have this pre-plan. How does this scale? That kind of thing. Whereas, frankly, a lot of times it's just great to get something shipped, right? And it's done the job, and now you just have to rework. But if it does put you in a position where you kind of have to rework and rebuild. For example, I've encountered a lot of Gatsby sites, and there's a common problem where if they have too many files, because you're generating those all at build time, your build process becomes super long. You discover that, oh, I'm waiting 3 minutes to build this website. Your cycle time turns terrible, that kind of thing. There are ways to get around that, of course, but it definitely gets rid of some of the simplicity of static site generator. Now, thank you for bearing with me for the story time. That brings us back to Remix. So, Remix, to me, feels like where we are really bringing it back to the client and server working together. It's kind of this great marriage of static server-side rendered sites and spas, essentially, where we're using a spa framework like React, but we're rendering those pages on the server. Now, there's various ways to do that. Next.js is probably the most popular, and it's actually the Remix talks about Next quite a bit and the comparisons to that. But let's go ahead and we'll talk about more of that as we move through some of the features that they discuss around Remix. So Remix can run almost anywhere. It actually does lean quite heavily into this concept of using distributed web infrastructure. If you all haven't heard of this yet, there's the idea of, well, if my server's in the US and my user is in Australia, I'm already paying, I think it's almost half a second, just based on the speed of light, to get my content to that user. With distributed infrastructure, they talk about running at the edge, whether that's on Cloudflare workers or in something like fly.io, where I've got my application distributed on servers all around the globe. And Remix does make that quite straightforward through a few things that we'll continue to talk about. So Remix talks about being fast, and in my experience, it definitely is. So nested routes is a pretty cool thing. What you often, and actually let's scroll right through this. Yes, so we're going to end, as we talk about this, we'll talk about more about request waterfalls. What happens here, this is showing off the comparison between a classic SPA and server-side rendered Remix. With a classic SPA, what happens is you begin by loading that JavaScript into the page. Once that JavaScript is loaded, then you're able to make requests to the server. So you see we get the spinner, and that is making its first request to JavaScript. And then once it actually loads that JavaScript, I'm going to give a bump here. It starts to actually make those requests. Whereas with Remix, it makes all those requests on the server in parallel. And once you have loaded the page, it is a full interactive HTML document to begin with. And then it just loads the JavaScript after the fact. So in the world of web development, as we've embraced SPAs, for a long time with JavaScript, there was this concept of progressive enhancement. And SPAs in general kind of throw that out the window. They just don't work without JavaScript. It's just not a thing. You know, typically, you'll even see if you load the page without JavaScript, you'll get some, hey, this page doesn't work without JavaScript, or something like that. Remix actually includes progressive enhancement by default, which is kind of amazing considering we'd almost tossed that out the window in a lot of ways with the way that we began building websites. Now, they make a big point of saying it's not progressive enhancement just for the point of progressive enhancement. It's progressive enhancement because it makes the user experience so much better. All right. So it's great to talk about loading the page quickly and making the page load fast. But this is where I think the next thing we're going to talk about is where I think Remix's kind of killer features are. Because for instance, with Next.js, you have the server rendering concepts. They're not quite as easily baked in, and I'm going to show you some of how we do that in Remix with the apps that I've built. But it's actually the mutations that are typically going to be the most complex parts of the website, where I'm actually modifying server data. I'm sending, as a user, I'm sending data to the server, and oftentimes that becomes a little tricky. We're trying to manage state. We're trying to get things updated properly, make sure that things aren't out of sync. And I have to say that this is where Remix really shows off its stripes. They've built in a lot of primitives into the framework, a lot of features into the framework itself that make for a fantastic experience with data mutations. So, I'll show you this first, and we'll see it more later on. When you deal with data mutations in Remix, we're actually going to drop back to old school forms in a way, which is super cool because they actually work even before the JavaScript loads. It's not that they want to have you run without JavaScript. It's just that sometimes, especially on a slower network, on a phone, something like that, you'll load the page. The JavaScript hasn't loaded yet. You try to click a button. You try to click a link. And you discover that nothing happens. Incredibly frustrating for the user, right? Well, these work even without JavaScript. You basically write up a form, have a server action. I'm going to show you that here in a second. And then we're going to see also some of these transition hooks, which are super slick. Error boundaries are also awesome. Haven't dealt with those as much, but it is something super cool that you don't see a lot of people dealing with nearly as much. You know, if an unexpected error occurs, you often just get a broken page entirely, whereas this will contain that error in it. So one of the things that I keep noticing about Remix as I build with it is not that it allows you to do things that you couldn't do before. It more allows you to do things easily that you should have been doing before, but weren't that simple, were kind of complex to implement. And the way that they've designed this framework really builds that in. All right, so we're going to go play. We're going to look at this app that I have built. So let's see if this actually works. I just registered this domain as we were waiting, and we'll see if the DNS is actually propagated yet. Okay, cool. Well, if you are interested, you can go check this out. It's Kroger.guru. I decided to build an app that used the Kroger public APIs because I was like, I want to check these out. So this is based off of the Remix starter, which is really simple to set up, and it's also built on the Indy stack. So I can go ahead. I'll show off the app real quick here. Oh, right. You know what? It doesn't. I don't think it doesn't have me registered yet, but let's do this. We'll just go through the. That's right. LastPass is failing me. All right. So this app essentially just makes it easy to create a collection of Kroger products, and then you can share that collection with others. So, for example, I can just click into this one that I've already made. I've added some stuff here. We can just create one ourselves right now. I like to eat food. I don't know if anybody else does. Any fans of food here? So you can see as we come into the app, I'm going to show you this, and then I'm going to show you how I've implemented it on the back end. So, for example, I'll search for pizza here. Excellent. And then we can just add any of these that we like, and it will be added to that collection. So, all right. And then we can publish that collection, and others can see it once they log in. One moment here. Okay. Okay, all right, that's not going to work right now, but no worries. We'll do that with the local one. All right, let's take a look at some code. How are we doing on time? Okay, about 20 minutes in. Cool, so this is on GitHub. If people are interested, I can make it open source, but it is not right now. How is the font looking here? Is that going to be big enough for everybody? Cool. All right, let's run through some of how this app works. So with Remix, the first thing you're going to hit is the root.tsx. And this is the kind of their app entry point. And you can see I'm able to export links, for example. So if I've got a style sheet that works on a specific page, all I do is add it to this links export, and that will be added. I can add a meta function that is exported, which then Remix calls and will add to my metadata. You can also see here the loader, which is vital to, you'll see this a lot. This is how we load our data so that it can server render the page. And then we have our default export, which is going to be the content that we're putting on the page. So once we get in here, Remix has this concept of outlet. And get into that, we'll talk about the way that Remix does routing. Remix uses primarily file-based routing. Now, as you develop into, if your site develops into something more massive, you may discover that you want to do more configuration around the routing to opt out and do specific things. Maybe if you're loading based on other features, but you can absolutely do that. That brings to mind something I want to point out. Pretty much all of the stuff that Remix builds in is easy to get out of the box of. So it has a recommended path, and by following that path, you're going to make it a lot easier to build your application. But what, that's in comparison to some other frameworks that I've used in the past that really put you in a box and make it easier to build. But once you try to step out of that box, things just go to hell. So for instance, I used to work with web forms. I don't know if anybody else ever worked with that back in the day, SPNet web forms. If you tried, web forms was amazing, but if you stepped it all out of the box, you were on your own. It was going to get hairy for a while there. For instance, Ember as well. When my experience with it, it likes to control data, and if you did something that was not really what Ember was expecting, it wouldn't handle it very well. I've not discovered that yet with Remix. I found it to really, I've mostly followed their paradigms, but I can see ways to kind of step out of that box if I need to. So I think that's pretty cool. Anyway, I've got this outlet here, and what that outlet is it's going to render the routes that are underneath this. So we start with the root, and then we look into this routes collection here. Now, the home page is going to be our index.tsx. And that is going to be rendered into the outlet of the root. Then you can see here in this one we have another, where is it? Okay, we don't have it, sorry. And then to navigate from here, we can check it out. We'll go ahead and go to, make sure this is started up. Okay, we are already running, so we're good there. Let's look at this guy in our browser. Okay, so I'm already logged in. This is rendering our index.tsx. Now, you may notice we're using TypeScript. That is not required, but that is recommended. One of the things you'll notice along the way is that Remix is kind of opinionated. It makes a lot of decisions for you, which is wonderful in many ways. If any of you who used React in the past, you may have discovered that one of the issues with React is decision fatigue, where there's so many different options for how you can build your application. And so frameworks have developed out of that to accommodate that. Create React app is probably the simplest example. Next also, but what those will often do is create a simpler path to getting up to speed, also relying on others who know more about the ecosystem to make some of those decisions for you. So especially if you're not a React expert, it can be super helpful to have some of those decisions built in. So you'll see here that we're using TypeScript. I am really pleased with that. I really like using TypeScript. Perhaps that comes from the fact that I got started with statically typed languages. But that is the default for Remix. All right, so we've got our index.tsx. And then if I go over here and I click in, I can view my collections. That's going to take me to the collections route. And that is going to, first of all, load this page here, which is the collection TSX. So routing is going to go, it will first look in this top level routes collection, and then it'll start looking folder-wise, and then the routes actually go with the path. So let's take a look here at this one. All right, so you'll see here again, so this is actually the page that we're seeing right now, and that we're rendering the ability to create a new collection and any collections that are already there. So you'll see as well this outlet And so the outlet is going to render the content underneath it. So anything in this collections folder, whatever matches the path. So in this case, there is nothing after collections. And what we're going to go ahead and render is this index TSX, no collection selected, which you can see right here. Now, that's what's going to get rendered into the outlet right now. If we go ahead and click into this one here, we'll go ahead and it's loading this collection. Now you'll notice that loaded all at once. And that is kind of the magic of the server rendering. What you would often see in the case of a React app is I would click into that, it would show the page, and then it would it would show a spinner, and then it would load that data from the client and then build up the page from there. In this case, you can see it built the page on the server and then immediately loaded it in. That has a lot of advantages in that we're talking about SEO, we're talking about user performance, and also less cumulative layout shift. The other thing that's really nice is that typically your server is going to have a faster connection to your data source than your client will. And so instead of forcing your client to make all those different requests, considering often you'll have to make a chain of requests that happen or several in parallel, you're allowing the server to do that, load that data for you, and then we render that on the client. So, all right, you can see here I've clicked into a collection, and that's going to load this collection ID.tsx. The $sign at the beginning means that it matches the route, and that becomes a parameter in the props that are provided. So this is my collection details route, and you can check out the loader that I have here. So my loader is going to receive the request and the params from the page. This is just a hook that is built into the starter. We can actually look directly at that, but it's essentially just fetching the user from the session and then getting that there. Let's go back. So we also use this invariant, which is super nice. It's just basically saying, I want to declare that this thing is around, and then we can go get the collection from the database. One of the nice things, so this is another case where Remix has been opinionated. And what I used to build this app is something called the Remix Indie Stack. So we'll take a quick look at Remix stacks. There are several of them now, and with new ones coming out every day. But there are a few of them that were built by the Remix team. Now these all kind of riff on the idea of Remix with music. So for instance, you'll see the blues stack and the indie stack and the grunge stack. Now these stacks make a few decisions for you around what database you're going to use, what deployment method you're going to use, and a few other details there. The indie stack is going to be something really simple setup, essentially free to run unless you have tons of users. So basically it's going to deploy to Fly.io. It's going to use a SQLite database, so it's just kind of built into that little server. And it's also got some testing built in, Cypress, for example. So it actually comes with Cypress tests, which gives you a great opportunity to become familiar with the Cypress testing process. I've really enjoyed that part of getting to know Remix. You can also see they've got the blues stack and the grunge stack. So for example, these are both going to have more of a dedicated database versus something where it's got this SQLite. One of these, if I remember correctly, runs on AWS, and another one runs, I think, on, this one runs on Fly.io. But what it comes with is you don't have to use any of these, but it gives you a super simple deploy story as a result. So here, this deploy.yaml was built into the app as I as I started it up, it has built-in testing, linting, type checking, all of that, and it actually deploys directly from GitHub without really any changes to the deployment. I did have to set a few variables, secrets in GitHub, but other than that, it was incredibly straightforward, about 5 minutes to get up and running. And I can show you that later if we have time. All right, getting back to this. So this uses Prisma under the covers to query the database. One of the nice things about Remix is that because of the client and server marriage, you can, and loading the data on the server, you don't have this concern of, you don't need to worry about sending your credentials to the client. Anything in a server.ts file is only going to run on the server, and then this loader is only going to run on the server. So this is essentially, the loader is what's getting the data for this route. You'll see I'm retrieving the collections, and then I'm returning all this data via this JSON helper. That data then gets provided into my component. So I simply use this useLoader data hook, and I'm able to take all this data, generate my page either on the server if I'm loading it for the first time, or it's generating in the client. So this is, if I turn off the JavaScript, oh, wrong thing. So one of the things that they kind of love to show off is that all of this does work even without JavaScript. So if we load up our DevTools, and we can, actually, I have a JavaScript. We can turn off the JavaScript and come on, did that work? Sometimes it takes, there it is. So you'll see that my JavaScript is turned off by that red button. I can still click in here and add a new collection. So, and all of that works without JavaScript turned on. It sent the request to the server, it created the collection, and it redirected me to the page to see that new collection. Now, some of this won't work if I have JavaScript turned off, and we can, actually it does an interesting thing there, which I'm going to look into that more. But most of this will work even if you don't have JavaScript on. Pretty slick. And again, like I was saying, it's not just a matter of if the user has JavaScript turned off. It is before JavaScript. So like on a low-end device, oftentimes your page will load the HTML, and then you're waiting for that JavaScript to boot up before you can even interact with it. In this case, if you know where you want to go, you can simply navigate there before the page is loaded. All right, so let's dig into some of the cool stuff that we're using in here. All right, here you'll see our form. And you'll see it's a capital F form versus a lower F form. So this is a Remix enhanced form. This is rendered on the client as a, excuse me, as a HTML form, but once the JavaScript boots up, it does things a little bit differently. You see I've got a few of these. Oftentimes the button, so you'll see I've got these submit buttons, and that is a big difference with Remix. So oftentimes if I was building a classic React app, this would simply be an on-click handler for that button. And I would send my data to the server via Axios or whatever you prefer as far as your client-side HTTP client. But in this case, I simply built it as a form. You'll see this over and over again. Remix is a throwback to many of the ways that we did things in the past in the history of web development. So here's my form. I can publish, I can delete the collection, but we'll actually show off some cool things here where, oh, it's actually down a level. It is, I remember where I was doing this. Okay, so in my search.tsx, let's view how we do searches. So most of this, you'll see we're just using classic forms. It's making a post to this action in the collection page. And I've got a few different ways that I differentiate between what has been sent. I've got a few different ways to send data. So I might say send a delete or a publish or a remove product or an add product, sending that to this page. All right, so, but down a layer, when we look at search.tsx, you can see that this is a component that has its own loader, but it doesn't export a default. So this doesn't actually have a server-loaded components. But you'll see that we're using something cool called fetcher. And fetcher is when you are dropping out of, so if you are in classic HTML, in classic web development, you would model a mutation, a form submit as a navigation. You would do a post to the server and it would return content, or do a redirect or something along those lines. With the built-in Remix forms, you're doing the same thing. The idea is to do some kind of navigation as part of the process. UseFetcher is more like your Axios or something along those lines, where you are sending a request to the server and you're getting it back in the client, and it's entirely handled on the client side with the rendering of that. So I'm using this little UseFetcher hook, and then I'm creating a form off of that fetcher, this search fetcher. And you can see I'm using a get method. It's making a request to this /search endpoint. So this here, you'll see in my routes, I've got this search.tsx, and that automatically will route get requests to this loader, which is pretty slick. So it's the code for rendering that component and, the component code and the data code lives in the same file. Obviously, I've abstracted a lot of the code that actually does the fetching, but those two live together and makes it harder for them to get out of sync. So I am making that request, and we can actually witness this on the server. So for instance, if I do a search for pizza, you'll notice that it turns this button to searching, and then my actual results show up. And I can add items to the collection, and then it'll show in collection. This is surprisingly easy to implement, where we would start showing that. So the fetcher itself has a state. This is one of the little things that Remix has built in that I haven't seen in other frameworks. And you can query into that state and see, hey, okay, what's actually happening here? And I can check, hey, if the state is submitting, I can simply change to this UI to show that that request is pending. I probably should disable the button at the same time. I guess I forgot about that, but we can actually do that quite easily. So disabled equals searching. So that will prevent me from making another request at the same time as the other one. Now, that's actually not that important, because Remix does this cool thing where if I were to issue a second request, it would cancel that first one, and I wouldn't have to worry about those results. So if I search for pizza, you'll see I'm searching, and clicking the button does nothing now. So that button was just disabled. I think that's an incredibly easy way to interact, because these are things that we'd have to handle manually via looking at whether that has returned yet, and we'd have a callback or something along those lines. This itself just makes it super easy to introspect into the state of my requests, and then make my UI better based on that. So what else do we want to show here? So you can see, as we're showing, that fetcher is loading in this data, and then I'm getting that data out of my fetcher simply using this search.data destructuring here. All right, I do want to pause. Do we have any questions yet, Rylan?
Nothing's come up yet.
Okay, cool. Do we have any questions in the room so far? All right. Either I've lost you all or it makes perfect sense. One of the two. So super positive or super negative. We'll see what happens. All right. What else do we got here? So here you can see the Cypress tests that are already built in. I was able to quite easily modify those to make sure. And what is cool about this is that's built into my deployment. So it'll check my deployments as they're going out, and it's a full CI/CD pipeline. All right, what else do we have here to show off today? Just a moment here. All right, so see here we got about 15 minutes left. So I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about some sum up on my thoughts on Remix, and then we can leave some time for either to run through the stuff that you all want to look at, or I can take questions or however that works. So the big question in my talk was Remix, is it worth the hype? And I would say yes. I think that based on my experience with Remix, it does some really unique things that are pushing forward the React landscape and the web application landscape in general. We get this really cool marriage of a client-side framework in React with the server-side rendered application, and a lot of the benefits of both, without a lot of the trade-offs that you'll see a lot of frameworks are making. So then the question then becomes, should you use Remix for your next application? And that's going to be, as always, the classic software developer, software architect. It depends. If you are doing something like it's simply a document site or something like that, maybe go with something simple, just a classic server-side rendered framework if that's what you're familiar with. On the other hand, Remix will do that perfectly well. If you're doing something where it is going to be a CRUD app or something like that, I think Remix will actually work really well for that, with the way that it models data mutations and the way that it makes it easy to create those pages and give the user a great interactive experience. Okay. But there are also going to be times where you may not where you may just be building a fully interactive app. And I think that while I haven't done it, I think that a lot of the stuff that Remix has built in will work for you really well. Like I said, if there is something that isn't quite fitting your needs, you can opt out of it and use something different that works better for you. What was the question?
So Mary referenced a tweet from Ken Dodds.
Mm-hmm.
Tired of arguing over which state management library to use. With Remix Run, you don't have state management, it just is. So she's asking if you can talk about Remix's relationship to state management.
Absolutely. So you've seen a lot of that so far. I'm sorry? So yes, so the question was about managing state in a Remix app. And really, most of it is managed with this loader function. What you'll, so in apps, a lot of times you will see where you've got to make this request, then you merge that into your data, or you make another request for the data. Remix actually handles that for you extremely well. When I have submitted one of these forms, made a mutation of some type, Remix is actually in the background. We can look at it here. So I will open up my dev tools. We can check our network. And so, for instance, I'm going to go ahead and publish this collection. And you can see that it's made this post request to the server. Actually, I'm going to do a bump here. Oh, it's not bumping the dev tools. I hope you can see this well enough. But essentially, we've got a post to start, and we've got 3 gets afterwards. And so Remix is kind of managing that state for you. It makes that post, and then in the background, it says, I'm going to go refetch the data for all of the routes that are matching this one. So you'll see this here is the data that was fetched for the collections.jsx, that kind of parent collection route. And then this here is the matching $ collection ID, where it's matching this part of the route here, and it goes and it fetches the data for each of those pieces. So Remix is kind of managing that data for you, which is really kind of magical. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so Bruce is asking, how does bundling work with Remix?
That's a great question. So,
the question, if you can repeat.
okay, yes, thank you for reminding me. I appreciate that. So that's another additional cool thing about Remix. It kind of has all the stuff that you would expect built in. Bundling, minification, transpiling, all that stuff. So I didn't set up any of that. I didn't have to worry about it. But let's go ahead and we can reload this page here. We'll actually bring up our dev tools and then do a reload. And you'll see that we're loading various chunks along the way. So we've loaded the actual root, which is going to be that HTML document. We load the manifest, and then images, and then you'll see we start to load the bundles. So for example, here's our root bundle for that root.tsx. Now we pull in the index, and then we've got a couple other chunks that we're bringing in of various code. So you'll see that they're doing bundling and code splitting under the covers for you based on this routing that you have. So based on the routes that you're hitting. I hope that answered your question, Bruce. If I answer your question and I haven't fully covered it, please submit another one. You got another?
Yeah, Joel is asking, and this might be related, how do you deploy a Remix application?
Awesome, yes, I'll be happy to show that. So the question is, how do you deploy the application? And so obviously, as a modern framework, they're going to encourage you to deploy via CI/CD. And they have a lot of that built in already. So you can see as I push up changes into my main branch, it's going to go ahead and deploy those to the actual running app. Or if I deploy to a staging branch, it will publish those to a staging app. But you cannot, so you can publish to a variety of targets. So for instance, Cloudflare workers, Netlify functions, Fly.io, but unlike static site generators, you can't just publish to a CDN so easily. There is a workflow where you can generate a static site using Remix, but you kind of have to build that yourself. Essentially, you're going to curl each of those pages and then pull them down and then push that up to a CDN. But Remix does require a server runtime. They're very intentional about that. And I think that they would say that for most apps where you're going to have user data, where you're going to have, for most apps where people are paid to create it, you're going to have user data, you're going to have dynamic things going on, and that moving away from having that server runtime is a mistake. Now, there are definitely scenarios where a static site, for a static site generator, will do the job just fine. Something like a personal site, a blog, something like that. Those are great places, but there's also really easy ways to do that with Remix that are going to give you incredible performance and the ability to do more advanced things. Any more questions? Yeah.
So Chris is asking, does Remix play nice with other packages? Or I would add, are there any packages that they do not play nice with?
So the question is, does Remix play nice with other packages? And yes, you can use a variety of libraries with Remix. Obviously, I have in a lot of ways. You can take a look at the package JSON here. There's nothing yet that I've found that it doesn't play nice with. So for example, I was wondering, they are the Remix team is very enthusiastic about web standards. They encourage you, they say, hey, as you are learning Remix, you are learning the web. So you'll see in this search TSX, for example, any of these, when the search, actually we'll look at this collection here. So when this data comes in from the client, it's a form data, which is an actual web type. That's just the way that JavaScript handles it. So I feel like I got away from the question and I forgot.
I'm sorry?
Can you give me the question one more time?
Does Remix play nice with other packages?
Yes, so it does. I actually asked the question on Twitter. I was like, hey, so it uses fetch behind the scenes. It polyfills fetch, so you have fetch in any Remix app, even on the server. And I don't know if y'all have used fetch. I don't personally find the fetch API to be that intuitive and easy to use, but I asked, hey, can I use got instead? And they said, sure, whatever you want to use on the server to fetch your data from other servers or anything like that is totally cool. So I'm using Prisma, I'm using got, I'm using a lot of different things behind the scenes here.
All right, Matthew has a question. You mentioned bundling is built in.
Mm-hmm.
Can that be customized, for example, via a config file?
So there is a Remix config file, which I have not dove into super heavily yet, but I do believe that can be customized. There's a variety of things here. So for example, you can say, hey, server dependencies to bundle, and it's going to, there's all different kinds of flags you can put in here if you desire.
We got 3 minutes. Sean has a question. Does Remix facilitate / encourage accessibility?
So I would say, yes, thank you. The question is, does Remix facilitate or encourage accessibility? I would say yes, based on for a variety of reasons. They're encouraging you to use the web, to use the base HTML and stuff like that. That is already built in. And so I would say, obviously, a lot around accessibility is the work that you're doing, but to make sure that you're testing and that you're giving the good user experience, but they're using web primitives, and oftentimes accessibility is going to work great with those web primitives like forms and stuff like that. So, yeah.
No other questions at this time.
All right. Well, we got about 2 minutes left. I think this is probably a good place to stop. I really enjoy you all being here. I thank you for being a part of this. If you are looking to learn more, I actually just added a document to that web. If you own, maybe I'll open source this after the fact. But if you want to learn more about Remix, there's some awesome videos. Remix singles created by Ryan Florence will teach you all about the way that you can use the platform, use the Remix platform to make your websites better. Building better websites with Remix. This is actually a talk that Kent C. Dodds did at my meetup, which was really cool. Learned a lot about Remix that way. The Remix docs and tutorials are fantastic. I highly encourage you to go through those if you have any interest in learning more. And then if you have used Next or something like it, it can be really useful to read through this Remix versus Next doc to understand where the similarities and differences are. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate you listening to my talk, and I hope that you have a great time at Star Trek.